Yeah.
Yeah, I will. All right. So, hi, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to the 46th annual Trenton Computer Fair event. Thank you guys for joining us. My name is Nithya Nalori, and I'm a computer engineering student at the College of New Jersey. So today I have the honor of introducing our speakers and the topic for today's session. And today's session will go from, well, I guess 10:20 to like 11:10, I believe. So we have like around 50 minutes now. And I will now talk about the topic for today. So, the topic for today's session is communicating climate change and challenges, and this will be presented by Holly Caggiano and Sonia Ahmed. I hope I'm pronouncing your names correctly. Please correct me. All right, great. And they are from Princeton University and Michigan Technological University. So I'll be reading the abstract for today's topic. To achieve climate change, mitigation efforts and national net zero goals depend on end-use electrification and widespread adoption of energy efficient technologies by households. How can we effectively communicate the need for energy efficient and renewable technologies in households and beyond? What will encourage stakeholders to buy in, spark widespread adoption and support these technologies? This panel will draw on current social science research and address questions around green technology and adoption and behavior changes. And now I'll be passing over the session to Holly and Sonia.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm going to get my screen shared. So I think we're all good and you should be able to see it. It's wonderful to be here. My name is Holly. I'm currently a postdoc at Princeton's Andlinger Center for Energy and the Environment, and have been in New Jersey forever. I am a Rutgers alum, both grad and undergrad. And I'm joined by my colleague, Sonia, and I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I was delighted that Holly asked me to join her on this panel. So Holly and I met as part of a project that we're going to talk to you about in more detail, that is headed by Michigan Technological University with a lot of instrumental and close collaboration with Rutgers. So I'm also a postdoc, but I'm at Michigan Technological University, although I am pleased to say that I live here in New Jersey, and even though Holly and I are probably live and work within a half-hour driving distance of each other, we didn't meet in person until about 2 weeks ago because I started during the pandemic my work with this project, and we'll talk more about the impacts of COVID on all of this as we get going. So yeah, I'll turn it back over to Holly.
Yes, it has been both exciting to start meeting in person, but also to still have the flexibility to do stuff online, and be able to reach a wider audience. So we're happy to be here today and to talk about climate change and tech in the household, and communicating impacts and creating change. So I'll jump right in as the big questions that we want to talk about today, and in the context of this larger project that we'll introduce in a little bit. What role do households play in mitigating climate change? And then what technology barriers do we face at the household level? How can we shift decision-making to prioritize sustainable living? And then what opportunities can household technology survive? So thinking about all of this in the context of tech for this conference, but also because it's incredibly important to meet climate goals. Just as a very broad overview about how household behavior impacts climate change, might seem obvious, but we produce emissions just as a part of living daily life. The things that we do just to meet our basic human needs: shelter, clothing, nourishment, consume resources, and contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. And so some theorists that think about this through a social science lens understand resource use as organized around shared practical understandings. So I always like to use this picture when I talk about it of, all of the different things going on in the kitchen and the family thinking, why is our bill so high? These are all very culturally important ways that we live in the world and feed ourselves and take care of ourselves. And these emissions, I'll break it down a little bit with some stats, but they can be direct or indirect. And so when I refer to direct emissions, that means emissions that are coming directly from the source. So if we're driving a car that's powered by gas, and especially our heating from natural gas. So those are the two largest categories of direct emissions in the household. But many of these emissions are also indirect, which means that they don't directly emit greenhouse gas emissions, but have associated emissions. So some examples of this are electricity that you purchase from your energy supplier, or the treatment of water and water waste, and the growth and transport of the food that we eat. So you can see kind of in these red boxes what some of the indirect emissions look like at the household level. A lot of emissions around food. There's more discourse recently around meat consumption and agriculture and climate impacts. So when we think about it at the household level, we're really trying to get at this very diverse array of behaviors and sources of emissions. So just to situate kind of how important thinking about households are in the context of mitigating climate change, these direct emissions account for about 38% of overall US emissions, which is quite high. And then if we were considering both the direct and indirect emissions coming from households, this is about 80% of all energy used, and a similar share of greenhouse gas emissions. But even though direct emissions are a large source, it's mostly coming from these indirect emissions that maybe we're thinking about a bit less, about 77% coming from indirect energy consumption. So the way that Sonia and I are thinking about this in the context of the project that we're working on is through the food, energy, water nexus as this way to kind of capture the interconnections between resource systems that produce both these direct and indirect emissions. So it captures these tensions and trade-offs between systems and focuses on the embedded resource use in these indirect emissions. So it's useful at the household level to capture these interconnections as we're using a lot of food and energy and thinking about how energy is a part of that. So I think this figure is quite helpful in just thinking about all of the energy conversion required for all of these kind of necessities in daily life, that water needs to be cooled when you create energy. There's water needed for food production, energy for water treatment and pumping. There's kind of this whole kind of circular variety. So thinking about that at the household level has been quite helpful for us in our framing. So you can kind of think about the household as a food, energy, and water system that both exists at this global scale where we're thinking about natural resources, and then scales down to local and regional contexts in which we have energy that has to be produced and transported to the house, as well as water and food. Acts as kind of inputs into the house, and then results in waste and emissions, and thinking about things like water stress and other aspects of resource use. And we also know that from a technology perspective, household electrification is incredibly important to meeting climate goals, and specifically the US net zero goals, most recent to reach net zero by 2050, which I think some other speakers will also be talking about today. And coming out of Princeton's Net Zero America study, which I believe there's another session about, which is exciting, presented by Eric Larson in the afternoon. So I definitely recommend checking that out to get some of the context for this modeling. But that modeling exercise explains that at least half of all new car sales by 2030 will need to be electric to reach these net zero goals. And over the next 10 years, we need to actually double the number of homes with electric heat pumps. So transitioning over from natural gas or even oil. This image, we know that the tech is improving and that we're getting there, and that it's becoming more accessible. This is just, a bunch of the new EVs that are becoming available in 2022. So we are starting to get there. So some of the things that we know from the social science literature about adopting green technology at the household level, we want to understand, well, how visible is the change? That's going to impact the way that people think about it. Rooftop solar that all of your neighbors can see versus maybe retrofitting your heat pumps that nobody really knows about, but is going to save you money in the long run if you own the house. How achievable is the change, and how achievable is it perceived to be by the people that are doing it? Does it seem really hard? Does it seem really difficult? Does it seem cost prohibitive? Are people aware of the subsidies available? Are people aware that costs may be going down? Then thinking, do I have the agency to make the change? Sonia and I, before this call, were just kind of talking about some of the intricacies of thinking about buying an electric vehicle. I live in a 2-family house where we have a shared driveway that we switch off every other month. Can I really realistically buy an EV and know that I can charge it and in my driveway and have the infrastructure? So thinking about, renting versus owning your home where you live, it's even more challenging in a multifamily building. And then what's quite important to people, and has been the subject of some of my research, is, does it fit into my lifestyle? Do I see myself as a green person? Or do I see myself as a person who's kind of up on new technology and interested in new trends and willing to be an early adopter? So some of my work has looked at efficient purchases, and this specific study looks at efficient light bulbs, efficient appliances, and efficient vehicles. And I found that values, and these two types, altruistic or the importance you give to how other people feel, or biospheric values, how important you prioritize the earth and the natural world, impact people's level of environmental concern, how worried they are about climate change, how concerned they are about the environment, which impacts what I'm calling in this green lifestyle, or how much somebody sees themselves as an environmentalist or living an environmentally centered lifestyle, which affects which purchases they make. So kind of all of these factors are important. And moving from the kind of individual to the structural, thinking about the idea that consumers can be locked in technologically, organizationally, societally, into these forces that determine demand. Right now, we don't have a huge market of used EVs, for example. Some of these things can be quite expensive. We don't maybe have as many subsidies as we'd like maybe that were in the Build Back Better that people were kind of expecting, some of these subsidies for heat pump retrofits. How are people kind of locked into the lives that they live? And so I think this quote by Eisenhower is quite helpful as, thinking about the intersection between choice and decision-making and structure, and that consumer culture is more complex than just aggregated individual choice, that our cultures are products of history and context. They rise out of, reflect, and simultaneously structure our material realities, productive systems, methods of exchange, social organizations, and political structures. So now what? And I'm going to turn it over to Sonia to start talking about a little bit about the FUCON project.
Well, thank you so much, Holly. That was a terrific setup for what I'm going to dive into some more details on. I always learn something when I listen to Holly talk about her research on the overarching context. So as I had mentioned earlier, she and I are working together on a project that we refer to in shorthand as FUCON. So expanding that a little bit more, the Food, Energy, Water Conscious Project. We can expand it even further. This is an NSF funded study, initially for 5 years, but we had a couple of extensions in there. It's still going on now. It began in 2016, and its larger title is Reducing Household Food, Energy, and Water Consumption, a quantitative analysis of interventions and impacts of conservation. The stated goals were to identify household consumption behavior hotspots and interventions to reduce resource use. I should also mention that this project was funded via the NSF through a program called Infuse, which was looking more broadly at the food, energy, water nexus. It was one of roughly 100 or so projects that received funding nationwide. And it was one of very few to look at this question of the interdependencies between our very complex food, energy, and water systems from the point of consumption. And as Holly mentioned, consumption drives a lot of these activities. So it's a very interesting place from which to focus our inquiry. And while some large-scale changes and system-level changes need to come from the supply side, so what kind of fuel source is used to power our electricity, a lot of it also trickles down and is driven by what consumers do, how they behave, what they're willing to adopt. So it's really part of a larger intricate question, and it was really interesting to approach it from the consumption side through this project. I'd done other research that had looked at the supply side before joining this. And then the hope here is that we get research insights that can be applied to increase well-being, improve resource scarcity. We're hearing, of course, more now about water scarcity in some parts of the country and some parts of the world. This is a very serious issue, perhaps less so in the Northeast, but it certainly impacts us as well. And of course, we know we need to think about getting to net zero in terms of our carbon emissions to mitigate and reduce the impacts of climate change in the next century. Next slide. Okay, so a little bit more about this FUCON project that we're working on and its interdisciplinary nature. So there's a much more of a realization now amongst scientists and policymakers and thought leaders more broadly that we often think in disciplinary silos, and to challenge these so-called wicked problems. I don't know if you've heard that framing. We need to think across these silos. We need to be talking across disciplines, and we need to be seeing what we need to do collectively to bring about these larger changes at the societally and globally, which gets to be even a bigger question and problem. So we had at this small scale here for this project continuous feedback between our research sub-teams. We can see here this is color-coded. So we had people who are experts in socioeconomic side of this, social scientists like Holly, a little bit like myself, although I wear multiple hats. We had people on the engineering side working in life cycle assessment. So a life cycle assessment is looking at the overall impact of something like an electric car on the environment. So what materials did we need to make that? How much collective energy and water inputs were needed? What is the profile of the use of this particular consumer object? And then what are the environmental impacts when it's disposed of? So cradle to grave kind of thinking. And we had teams looking at that. Technology, climate, and policy. We had people looking at climate models for some of our study areas. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, and Holly will too, as we get further into this talk. And then we had computer science teams working with us on a specific tool called the Home Tracker, which I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about. But it was a way to get households to communicate to them exactly what they were consuming in a given time period. And it's been a really rich conversation, I would say, between all of these different teams and disciplinary experts to move this study forward. Next slide. Okay, so one of the inputs here, we were able to contract with an outside provider of electricity data. So I was talking about this sort of as being a collective challenge. And one of the things I think it's recognized nationally that we need better data on is how much are households consuming on a hour by hour basis, and this is getting more fine grained. So how much are they consuming even minute to minute? We were able to get access to data from a third party provider for 30-minute interval data for our households. So how much were they consuming every half hour for 3 years? And as you might imagine, there are some interesting things we can learn about that. And here, as you can see from the title of this slide, COVID was a game changer here because people's patterns of electricity consumption, of course, dramatically changed during the lockdown periods. And even now, we're seeing some spillover effects. This is just a quick representation. What you're seeing on screen here is for the 189 households in a specific study that we were looking at consumption at the household level, what was their average usage for this 3-year period? And we can zoom in on daily patterns and cycles. And I can say a little bit more about that if people are interested later about, there's something called a duck curve. So right now, household electricity usage tends to peak in the morning, drop off during the day when people are away from their house, and then peak again in the evening. And that's called a duck curve. And that, of course, has large implications for how power plants have to operate, right? Because our grid operates now in real time. So when you're turning on a light switch, the supplier has to immediately compensate and provide more electricity. If that doesn't happen, we see power outages. So our patterns at the household level affects what those suppliers have to do. And that has implications too for when they have to bring additional plants online to meet peak demand. If we can flatten that curve a little bit, we can keep that consumption within a level where you don't have to bring additional power plants on, for example. Okay, next slide. So this is the Home Tracker web-based tool that I had talked about earlier to track household consumption. And this was developed by the computer science team at Michigan Tech in close collaboration with the other teams looking at household consumption. And here we had customized messages delivered to about 160 households in suburban Illinois about the greenhouse gas and water footprints from what they consumed, what food they bought, how much electricity they used, how much they used to natural gas, most of these households were using to heat their homes, and how much water they consumed. And so these messages were based on the utility bills and food purchases that we collected through this tool called Home Tracker that the participants were able to access and enter this data for. We had the team, I think, had grander ambitions when it started to try and get these things to be automated to feed in. But it turned out at the time, I think in 2017, as this was being developed, that we ended up having to rely on manual entry of their utility bill data, for example, that was then used to calculate what you can see here. So these are examples for two different households for their resource use. So their overall, this is greenhouse gases, that's GHGs there on the bottom left, and how much of their emissions were coming from the food that they bought, how much from the natural gas they used, and how much from the water they consumed. And then the same thing for their water withdrawal. While of course we know that the direct water use in gallons from their water bills, their food consumption also has implications for water withdrawal. So if you're eating a lot of something like almonds, for example, which are a food crop grown in California that has really high water usage in a water scarce area, you want to know that. And so similarly for meat-based diets, there's not only water but also greenhouse gas emissions that are much more than most people realize. Okay, so next slide. The project also involved the construction of a database and web portal. So we were collecting a lot of data from these households. In addition to specifics around the food, energy, and water they were consuming, these households were given about 12 surveys over an 18-month period to get at what Holly was talking about, sort of their attitudes towards consumption, towards conservation. We were also interested in how they felt about climate change, about COVID prevention, to try and draw connections and glean a wider understanding of how those things fed into their decision-making and choices around consumption. And so these are some details here about how the database that was constructed that I won't go into now. So next slide. One of the other really interesting components of this study that gets to the heart of what as an interdisciplinary team we were interested in was how do as scientists we communicate effectively about the impacts of climate change. And so our climate modeling teams put together a model that looked at the impacts of climate change in Lake County, which is where this study occurred. And then we fed these back. We showed them to our participants and asked them to tell us how it made them feel to learn this and what they wanted, how it might inspire them to change their behavior. And so and we also wanted to calibrate kind of what messages are most effective in getting a response that would encourage conservation. The first finding you can see here, so this is from the climate modelers, that if no effort is made to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by the end of 2100, summer weather in Lake County could last 56 days longer than at present, with an average heat index 12 degrees Fahrenheit higher than now. That's if we don't do anything. But if we do take aggressive mitigation measures to try and reduce these emissions, the length of summer is likely to be only 16 days longer, with an average heat index of only 1 Fahrenheit degree higher. So you can see there's a big difference there. And so then we asked our study participants how they felt about this. 83% were surprised. So they reflected some degree of surprise. So this ranged from a great deal to a lot to a moderate amount in each of these cases. 54% were angry. 49% felt guilty. Not too many, as you might imagine, were happy about this. Although on its face, a longer summer in a place like Chicago, near Chicago, might feel like a good thing. But so 79% were worried. I don't have it there, but 25% felt like they were prepared. So not that many felt prepared. Sadness was also evoked here, 74%, and 63% reported feeling fearful. And there were interesting differences in who was feeling what, because our sample contained people from a range. It was a fairly homogeneous sample, but even so, there were some differences in our group. So people who were more reported having more liberal political views tended to feel more angry, worried, sad, and fearful. People who were older were more surprised, more sad, and more fearful. And interestingly, people who reported higher education levels also reported feeling more angry. Okay, next slide. So that was our first message. The second message was a little bit less pleasant. So it was that today Lake County experiences about 6 days above 90 degrees on average per year. And if we keep our emissions low, this would about double to about 13 days per year. Higher emissions, so more CO2 in the atmosphere, would lead to up to 45 days above 90 degrees in an average year, which is a big increase from the 6 days that Lake County experiences currently. And so we had roughly similar reported emotions here. I won't spotlight anything there, but we did find a really interesting difference with this finding about these, many more days that would be quite uncomfortable and quite hot, that it was people who had higher incomes who actually felt guilty about this. So this, we think, presents us with something fairly interesting to really think about how to tailor these messages and who we should be targeting for these messages. And if they're feeling something like guilt, perhaps for these higher consuming individuals, they can also be encouraged to curb their consumption. And then over 90%, one more thing. Overall, though, 90% reported being concerned about the impacts of climate change, which we thought was very interesting and important. And yes, Holly, next slide. So then after seeing those messages, we asked these participants to tell us more about the ways they plan to adjust their actions to help mitigate climate change.
Thank you so much, Sonia. That was such a great overview. And I think that it's so interesting to think about how the emotions then tie into action. So this question was framed, we first asked if they plan to change their behavior based on the messages, or if they plan to take new actions, and then asked for tell us more. And a very large percent of these people did. This sample is also people that are concerned about climate change. They're people who wanted to be involved in a year-long study. It's not meant to be representative of the U.S. population, but in people that do care. And want to see their resource use and want to think about changing, what can we do? So we asked this open-ended question. And one of the most interesting things about it, and particularly relevant to talking to you all today about technology, is that a lot of people in these responses talked about adopting new household technology as an action that they would take in response to these messages. And so we just pulled kind of a small sample of some of these quotes. There are kind of a wide variety around different types of technology, but we tried to choose ones that represented kind of the spirit of what respondents were talking about. So one is, as I replace appliances, I choose the most energy efficient available, and I'm fortunate that I can afford the additional cost of those appliances. So this respondent did recognize that, this cost barrier. Another respondent answered that they would continue to convert natural gas appliances to electric, clothes dryer to an electric condensing dryer, stove to induction, furnace to heat pump. So it shows like really acknowledging, that they know what technology changes need to be made. Which I think is, we're not all at that page yet, that we actually know what technology changes we need to make to electrify. Then kind of just the more general that I'd like to have more energy efficient things in my home, or I'd love to get solar panels on my roof. So these are kind of emotionally tied responses. And in these, we know that a lot of them consider this tech lock-in or cost prohibitiveness. Like we had that respondent who acknowledged that they're lucky they can afford it. And we see in another respondent saying for our next house, solar panels and other electricity saving measures like insulation. But we're moving in a few years, so it's hard to do at our current location. Our next car will also be at very least hybrid and hopefully an electric one, if I can assure my husband that there will be enough power stations. I think this quote is really illustrative of the lock-in of, the current constraints of like, what can I do in my current house? I have to wait till I move. It's hard to do it here. If I can convince my husband to do it, a lot of people have range anxiety about electric vehicles, which, hopefully is getting better as batteries improve. And another that, expressing what somebody would like to do, but isn't currently within their ability. I don't make enough money to afford an electric car, but it is on my bucket list to do away with the traditional gas-powered car. So actions that people might want to take, but are quite locked into the technology that they have. And we don't always want people to replace things when they do still work. So considering that as well. And then a second theme, in addition to adopting new technology, is changing behaviors with technology that people already have. So some of them illustrative quotes here where we have our thermostat scheduled so the temperature in the house is higher when we're not home. I think pretty common. I use my Instant Pot instead of heating up the house with my oven. Maybe program the thermostat. I like that one because that's little, they weren't sure, but they might do it. And adjust water consumption and run times, dishwasher, washer machine, as well as be more conscious of lights and electricity plugged in. So this also shows another kind of competency and understanding that the times that they run their dishwasher matters to the grid and the kind of overall emissions that produced, which Sonia also touched on. So one thing that I thought was so interesting about all of the discussion about changing technology behaviors is that so many of them focused on thermal comfort, on heating and cooling in the home. And I thought this quote was particularly illustrative of kind of the challenges that I can lower the heat in the winter, but it's already at 66 most of the day. And I can raise the AC temp in the summer, but I've done that to where it's just better than uncomfortable. So thermal comfort is really important to people in their homes. I mean, I think we all can relate to that. We all understand everybody wants to be comfortable, and working with new technology or changing behavior with existing technology requires new competencies and new norms. So we saw some quotes about people talking about programming their thermostats or getting smart thermostats. So it requires these new ways of living in the home and knowledges around how to program these things. I think the smart thermostats are quite interesting that can understand your typical patterns, but are difficult if you don't have predictable patterns of being at work and at home. So kind of different for everybody. And then these norms around what temperature is acceptable to your whole household. Every kind of household is different and has different preferences. You'll always kind of know those people who their house always seems to be freezing cold, and it's like, wear a sweatshirt, put on a blanket. So everybody has their own tolerances. And so how do we change these norms around kind of what's an acceptable temperature in the house? And then something that we can't test the causality of, but we think is quite interesting, is thinking about giving these climate messages about a longer summer and about extreme heat made people think about temperature, because a lot of these responses were around thermal comfort, were around actions that they could take with heating and cooling. And so they'd also been getting these messages through the home tracker. So seeing that quite a lot of their electricity or their energy use comes from heating and cooling. I think also probably had a lot to do with it. But I think it's interesting in thinking about these messages and climate impacts. What actions does that make people kind of think about that they could change, and whether that's new technology or changing behavior with the technology that they currently have. So some of the main takeaways from these responses, and particularly with regard to tech, is that with adopting new technology, it's really important that we think about how to reduce cost and these lock-in barriers. How do we really incentivize this and do it in ways that make people realize that it is achievable, that it seems like something that they can do and that makes sense in their lifestyle. And also reaching out during transitions. We saw a big transition with COVID. We saw a lot of behavior changes because of COVID. People acknowledged the way that their behavior has changed in the household. They were very keenly aware of them. And then we also had a lot of these responses about, what I would change when things change. So when I move, I will do this. That we as researchers and practitioners acknowledge that the kind of one of the best times to reach people about new technology is when they're in a transition. When your old car dies, that is when you are thinking, that is when you are most primed to make that decision. When you are moving, you're most primed to start doing home renovations, and that can be quite disruptive, transitioning your house entirely to electricity. And then in terms of changing behaviors with technologies that we already have, establishing these new norms that I talked about, communicating them in a visible way, seeing what our neighbors do is quite powerful, seeing what people that we trust do is quite powerful, and also helping us to understand what we are capable of and what we might be able to do. There's a lot of studies specifically about solar panels and neighborhood diffusion, that it only takes a couple people usually to get them before it starts catching on in the neighborhood. And part of that is because then people see it as something that they can do and something that other people that they trust or that they perceive to be like them have done. And then considering lifestyle preferences, we saw this a lot in the responses. People don't like to be uncomfortable. Nobody does. We want to do this in a way that increases well-being rather than makes things more difficult. So thinking about how people see themselves, how different technologies fit into people's lifestyles, I think kind of marketing around technology typically does a good job in thinking about that. But I think there's been a lot of very interesting conversations about heat pumps. How do we change that word so that people understand that it can provide both heating and cooling, that it also acts as an air conditioner, and get people to understand that, maybe that is something that fits into your lifestyle or would make your life easier and better and increase your comfort. And then thinking about climate impacts that are specific to the group that we're targeting. So we definitely saw this in Lake County, which is a similar climate to New Jersey. But in New Jersey, we'll also see, impacts of sea level rise, more specifically, and increased severe weather, which we've already been seeing. So I think, also understanding how electrifying can kind of increase our overall resilience and thinking about things that way. And then just as a kind of larger takeaway from this project, that we need this interdisciplinary collaboration as a catalyst for changing household tech norms, and also just, changing norms around sustainability more broadly, integrating social science into technology, thinking about the ways that we message and market and explain how these things fit into people's lives. So we just want to acknowledge our project team, our principal investigators, David Watkins, Rachel Schwam, Chelsea Shelley, Chuck Wallace, Kara Cute, Ryan Cook, Will Little, and Jess Dignault. And Rachel Schwam, Kara Cute are both at Rutgers, professors in human ecology. And so we have our folks at both Michigan Tech and MTU, but also kind of expanded throughout. We had some Arizona State and Penn State, and a lot of really great folks working on this project. So while we still have a couple minutes left, we wanted to open it up to all of you and to the audience and have anybody kind of feel free to ask questions or start discussion. If you have specific questions about the study and kind of the work that we did and the work that we're still doing, but also the challenges that you've all faced around sustainability and technology, or questions you have about specific technologies and changing sustainability behaviors, if hopefully we could speak to some of those, or how you see the future of household electrification and what you think it will take to move the needle on this. So thank you so much for your time. And it's been fantastic to speak to all of you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Holly and Sonia. So now we are open the floor for questions. Do we have questions from the audience? Actually, since people are thinking, I do have a question too. We can open some other questions later on. So I'm very curious that I remember you two showed a status earlier in your presentation that household consumption of the energy takes us over 50% of everything. Do I remember that correctly? So that's kind of surprised me because I guess my question is about so what do you think about this household way from household or from the industrial? Because I would imagine that industrial level consumption would be much higher than household. And how does what if everybody started doing like more economic behavior? Would they make a change if the industrial field doesn't make a move to the more green technology side?
I think maybe Sonia and I, we could both kind of speak to this a little bit. I mean, I think we absolutely need both. We know that, and it's kind of this very tricky balance of that consumers have a lot of power in what they decide to do, and more so than this individual behavior, but changing norms more broadly. And I think consumers have a lot of power in kind of pushing industry to make change, but without large scale change. I don't think that households can do it alone.
Gotcha. Thank you. That's so any other questions from the crowd?
Actually, I'll just weigh in on that one as well. And Holly, this is maybe more of a little bit of a back and forth between us too. So I get your point completely about that kind of understanding where household direct energy use fits in with what industry uses, because as we know, that is immense too. So just to clarify here, because I think it can get a little bit complicated. So direct household energy use is 38%. That might feel in line, right? But then when you look at the indirect household energy use, that could be double counted from industry as well, right? So that's how much energy went into producing my keyboard, right? So that, because it took some industry to manufacture this. So there's a bit of double counting that we need to understand. So I drove this consumption because it ended up here. But it had to be produced somewhere. So I'm culpable, but so is the industry, right? In my end use of this item. And that's true for for what we drink, for the food we eat, those things, ice cream, for example, right? Which has to stay cold. We consume it, but it's got to be made somewhere and kept cold in some large warehouse. And then that's industrial use of energy. Does that line up, Holly, with your sentiment?
Absolutely. No, I think that's really important to explain, and that it is like it. And I think that a lot of the kind of life cycle analysis people have talked about this double counting and how to kind of best capture this. But yeah, it's like, households can control what they purchase and then how they behave in the household, but not the the energy that it was used to produce. Can choose to purchase items that claim to have used less energy in production, but is also often not very transparent or not within our control to kind of make those changes.
That's right.
I see your hand up. Thank you so much, Kai.
No problem. Yeah. So
Joan's
we have
hand.
a question here.
Yes, I have a question. Have you factored in the source of household electricity? For example, in my area, we can opt to have green renewable as a source of electricity. So I have my source is Pennsylvania wind power. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And also in having an EV, that would factor into when you're plugging in, where's your electricity coming from? Is it is it clean, or is it coming from a traditional source that's conventional gas powering the electric plant?
Absolutely. I've been thinking about that a lot with EVs, where it's like, okay, we can electrify everything, but it's not going to matter if we're, powering that electricity with fossil fuels. So I think, and I think both of us, Sonia, and I should speak to this too, but, I think most of the homes in this study were heated with natural gas. So at least, we kind of know those impacts, and we didn't measure vehicle fuel. We didn't measure that specifically in the study. And we know that we did ask about, who had EVs. So we know that there were a lot of hybrids and EVs in the sample. But yeah, no, I think my only answer is that's absolutely right. Sonia, what do you think?
Yeah, so it was taken into account. I worked a bit with the life cycle assessment team on this. And so you're absolutely right. Where you get your electricity from matters a lot. And we did track that. So we tracked the provider for electricity for most of the households, and it was, I think there were only 3 or 4 for our sample, 3 or 4 different ones, but they had different fuel mixes for the fuel source for generating the electricity, and that was indeed taken into account. And then we did have some solar panel folks in there too, so that also was taken into account in calculating their greenhouse gas emissions from their electricity usage. And then that other larger question around electrification, whether or not you're actually being more environmentally conscious and having less of an impact when you buy that electric vehicle, does depend on where you plug it in. And there have been some really interesting studies on this. And I believe one from, I don't know, maybe 5 or 7 years ago when I was studying smart grid for my doctorate, there was a national level study that looked at where you plug your car in. And in the places where electricity is coming from coal, for example, you may not be getting that much of a win. So they actually created a map that said these are the best places to get at the moment to get an electric vehicle. And it certainly does matter, that fuel source. So thank you for this question, because you're thinking like a life cycle assessment person.
I do, since I retired, I'm the activist, environmental activist. So these are some of the subjects that I've been speaking or writing about.
Mm-hmm.
That's fantastic. And I think especially at the kind of policy level, there's so many interesting, I've been thinking about this in kind of like the different local contexts around how much choice we have and how much community choice aggregation has spread and kind of allowing certain communities to purchase renewable energy and like leverage that collective power. But, how much are we able to control where our energy comes from and how much that varies by state? So I think kind of New Jersey has a ways to go. But it seems to be shifting, and hopefully we'll have some good wind energy pop on the grid soon.
Offshore wind, right? That's a very exciting new project.
I'll switch back to that question slide. But yeah, we'd love to hear from anybody that has any thoughts.
Yeah,
Can I ask?
Go ahead.
Yeah, this is Vicky here. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Holly and Sonia, for this fabulous presentation. Actually, I like to thank Joanne. Actually, she bring up something that I also kept in my mind because we know that energy actually they convert to each other. So I want to ask questions. So maybe you already covered this topic. I want to know, like, from technology side, did you share like the most recent study that we have to transfer energy maybe from our waste, like from the garbage, or from like something that we as human beings, we think that right now is not useful to us at all, to something that can be totally used in everyday life?
Sorry, your question was whether or not we communicated about that with our
So because of course I remember that you shared a survey that the householders, the families look at the stated statistics results of like how much energy they consume like every day, right? How much, of course, that we would feel guilty, like how much garbage we create every day, how much energy we use every day, of course, how much clean water we consume every day. But consuming is one side, and I also care very much about what is the other part, right? Because if you have the most recent technology to transfer your wasted things into energy, and we already know that we have something like that, but I want to know, like, do we have like a current study? Is that part of your study, or is that part of your like topic? Did we talk anything about that today? I want to know. Just curious. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for the question. I will say that there were a lot of people on the team who were quite concerned around the amount of waste generated by households. So we did ask that quite a bit, especially like during COVID. Do people think that their waste, their material waste actually increased, right? Because all of that extra packaging, for example, and the plastic bags and individual servings. But we didn't, so we asked about it and people were conscious of it, and often they did report that their waste increased during COVID. We asked about things like composting, which is another really important step that people can take that there may not be community support for, municipal support for just yet, as in they don't have a service that collects the compost. So people would have to take the initiative themselves. What we didn't do, and you raise a really interesting point about this, is measure, for example, the volume of their garbage, right? Because that might be another thing, or their recycling, or those other things that are really hard that take more effort to recycle. So yes, we didn't capture the physical dimensions of that in the study, but thank you for that question. It's definitely a really important.
Yeah, of course. As Joanne just mentioned, that where does the energy you use coming from actually matters, because you mentioned point out most people would feel good about themselves if they purchase like electronic car, right? But if you think that where is your electronic coming from? Like you don't burn gas by yourself, but if those plugins are, because I just mentioned that I used to work with Kai, we were pre-colleagues. I was from Energy Energy as well, and I designed this logo of this meeting. So I know a little bit more of like how those PowerPoint goes. Like I know how much gas and oil, even coal, like if it is not renewable, like they burn every year just to produce this electronic.
That's right.
Yeah. So I think that people need to think more, like when they consider like to consumer green things, like on the superficial level. And this actually brings to another question from me is, I think that you mentioned something about like economic study of how to on the people behaviors, like what do they think, like what are they thinking when they are consuming like either green or not green products. So can you share if you have any like most recent results, like how can economics do, or even people from psychology or other related areas to impact people to behave differently on this climate topic?
Yeah, I think that it's a great question and evolving, and kind of, I think in this sample, I think some of these kind of findings about reducing these costs and lock-ins, like I think I'd done a lot of thinking when Build Back Better was still a possibility about, we know we have a lot of kind of work on reducing costs and increasing incentives is good, but it doesn't actually always move the needle for people, especially if they don't see it as something that's achievable for them, or they think it seems difficult to claim the incentives. Like a lot of them come in the form of tax rebates when kind of some low-income populations don't typically file taxes. So how do we kind of think about this from a policy perspective? Of making these things easier and more achievable. And then I think there's also the kind of visibility and identity angle, and having these things kind of fit in with people's lifestyles. And I also want to be conscious of the time. I see that we're just about over and people are pouring in for the next session. But I wanted to wrap up.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. We really appreciate it, and feel free to reach out or get in touch.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much, Holly and Sonia.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation, everybody. I just added in the chat. There's a renewable gas source from an energy co-op where they you can sign up and have your gas from land energy that's converted from waste and landfills and etc. I put the link in the chat.
Thank you so much. This looks great. I can't wait to take a look.
Oh, you're welcome, and thank you for having this really informative seminar. I hopefully you can reach out to a broader audience, because actually you're speaking to the choir. Yeah.
It's this thing will be recorded, and we will broadcast it to more broader audience later on.
I'm glad to hear that.
They would lose the opportunity to ask questions, but they will definitely have the chance to review, rewatch the presentation.
Okay.
All right. Okay. Thank you, everyone. We'll have a few minutes break, and we're coming back later at 11:20. Okay. Thank you.
Welcome. Bye.